Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everybody. Great to be together again. I wonder, Alan, could we have that first slide up? That would be great. So I wonder if anybody can tell me what this is. Somebody got it right. I think that might have been Chris. Shout it loud. Landsat. And can you tell us a little bit more about Landsat?
It's a series of satellites that have been photographing and monitoring the Earth for quite a few years now.
Excellent. Yes. Do you want to come and finish my sermon as well? Superb. Yes, Landsat. Landsat number 9, in fact, this is. And you can see on the right, as you look, a picture of our beautiful planet. And as Chris said, this is a series of satellites that have been launched to photograph Earth from space over about the past 50 years, I think. And of course, as technology has improved, the quality of the images the satellites are able to return has improved. We kind of take this technology for granted now, and each satellite that goes up is able to do better work and build on that of its predecessors. So we can observe things such as deforestation, urban expansion, and so on, and see from that marvelous vantage point how the planet is changing. Perspective, the way we see things, has a great bearing on how we think and how we behave. We can take that first slide off now, Alan, thank you. And this was especially true for the first readers or hearers from Isaiah 40, which Barbara has read this morning. Their nation, the nation of Judah, had been through the mill. Once part of a much bigger country, a kind of greater Israel, they'd enjoyed a golden age under 2 kings in particular, David and then Solomon. And under David and Solomon, the worship of God had flourished. There was prosperity at home, there was peace on their borders. But this didn't last, and the country split into 2, with the northern half keeping the name Israel and the southern half adopting the name Judah. And this country, Judah, with its capital in Jerusalem, had some good kings, but it also, regrettably, had some bad kings as well. And in the end, God said through his prophets, enough is enough. Your big neighbor up to the north, Babylon, is coming. And when they arrive, it's going to be bad news. The temple will be destroyed. Many of you will be enslaved and deported effectively off to Babylon, and you, your great, once great nation, will become a province, a minor province in a bigger empire. And the shorthand name for this disaster is the exile. So if you're reading Isaiah, up to the end of chapter 39 is all about events before the exile, before people are carted off to Babylon. But then in chapter 40, we skip forward about 100 years over a lot of bloodshed and disaster. That doesn't get much mention in Isaiah. And we start thinking about, in chapter 40, the exile coming to an end. It's good news. This is a bit like the transition from 39 to 40 is a bit like what you may experience at the theatre when you come to the end of an act or a change of scene. The lights drop and you see these silhouettes moving around. And when the lights lift, suddenly you're in a different place. There's a new turn to the story. There's a different mood. So notwithstanding a lengthy wait, God promised that the punishment and the humiliation of exile would be reversed and there'd be a homecoming. Jerusalem would be rebuilt, resettled. And if you want to, you can read more about this in Ezra and Nehemiah. The people of Judah who found themselves exiled in Babylon needed to start seeing their circumstances from God's perspective, rather like Landsat 9 sees the earth from a very different perspective to us as people who are living down here, depending on the planet's resources. And for this to have a very practical and positive effect on them. You know that shame of exile you've experienced? Well, the long wait is coming to an end. Even in your crisis, even in your isolation, you can still trust that God will do what God has promised. Some of the phrases from Barbara's reading really, I think, bring this out with a bit of a punch. It is God who makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. This isn't just some abstract statement. This is about the king of Babylon. You know, the person who's oppressed you and put you down? Well, God's decided it's time for that to end. It's God who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them by name. Who's God calling out? The people of Judah. It's time to go home. And then one of the most famous and beautiful verses in the Bible. Even youths will grow faint and be weary, but those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. Run and not be weary, walk and not faint. These generations that had experienced exile and all its fallout would, in God's good time, as they waited, be given the strength to make the journey home. Now, for many of us, this exile, this pandemic, is a kind of exile, an upending of familiarity, isolation, loss of health, loss of money, in some cases, loss of life itself. And it raises big questions. Why has this happened? What's God's perspective on all this? Exactly the same questions the exiles in Babylon would have found themselves asking. And on the one hand, there's some comfort in this, knowing we're not the first generation to ever suffer a crisis. This doesn't take away the pain and the impacts of what's been going on the past 18 months, but all generations, all cultures go through upheavals from time to time. So we're not alone. The encouragement to wait for the Lord, which is central to these words in Isaiah, really kind of cuts away at our natural impatience to get back to normal as quickly as possible. But perhaps there's some purpose in this, for us as for them, that in the waiting we might become attuned to God's perspective, the way God sees things. Jesus, in our gospel passage, gives us a how-to of getting God's perspective on our lives and our circumstances. Come to me, he says. In those two verses we read, it begins, come to me. Not come to religion, not even come to church, not come to books, come to Jesus. Those things, they may have their place, but they're always the means and never the end. And everything we do in church, whether that's worshipping together, teaching, discussing, praying, fellowship, all of it is to bring us to Jesus. That's the good news. Come to me, says Jesus. And that is maybe one side of a two-sided coin. The other is that we come to learn, not on our terms, but on his. And this is where Isaiah, saying that Judah and the exiles need to see things from God's perspective, dovetails with the words of Jesus, when we learn from Jesus, we're not learning to make more money, not learning to feel better about ourselves. We're learning to get God's perspective, just as Judah in exile, encouraged to wait for and trust God for his plan to unfold. We may feel, I really do encourage you to reread those words from Isaiah, perhaps in your life groups or in your private readings. We may feel, as many of them did, that our ways, our circumstances are hidden from God. One of those verses there, why do you say, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? They were just the same as us. These questions, what's going on? The frustrations, the doubts. If we feel them, they felt them. They're perfectly normal. And waiting, frankly, is the last thing we want to do. But God's not in a hurry because he sees everything. Whether that's exile in Babylon or your frustrations with the pandemic or your unspoken questions of faith and doubt, God sees from a different perspective to us. Which is why Isaiah is able to say, haven't you heard? In response to those questions, does God see? Does God understand? He says, have you not known? The Lord is the everlasting God. He's the creator. He doesn't grow faint. He doesn't grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. So Jesus' invitation to learn from me is about getting that kind of God perspective on life and its unpredictable ebb and flow. And this takes unhurried time. Time in prayer, time in the Bible, time in relationships. There may be many reasons Jesus wasn't in a rush, but one must be that he trusted his heavenly Father. God was in control. And on those occasions when we're frantic, either actually literally racing about or frantic on the inside, for me at least, it's because I want to control everything. I want everything to be managed. There's a couple of occasions in the Gospels when we might have expected and wanted Jesus to get a bit of a gallop on. In Mark 5, for example, Jairus says, Jesus, come and heal my daughter. And on the way, Jesus meets a woman. She's got a bleed. He stops to attend to her. By the time he gets to Jairus, the little girl has died. And he raises her. But if you or I were Jairus, wouldn't we be saying, why the wait? Why so long? Why couldn't the other person wait? But Jesus didn't race around because he trusted his Father. And cultivating that pace in our lives, I think, relies on us believing in our deepest heart that God is actually sovereign. God is in control, as Isaiah says. We've become accustomed to speed and instant gratification, and waiting is easily seen as wasted time. In the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which, as you probably know, we're using as a bit of a source book for some of our talks this autumn season, John Mark Comer encourages us to do voluntarily those things that require us to wait, to switch off things perhaps that demand immediate attention. He suggests maybe deliberately joining a longer queue, not for petrol presumably, but a longer queue at the supermarket to make time to talk with someone. And he makes these suggestions, not because he wants to kind of punish us, you've got to wait, but voluntarily waiting cultivates the ability for when we have no choice but to wait. When something happens that is outside our control, we're less used to thinking, I can just fix it. Just learning to wait. So I encourage you to buy and read this. I'll I'll put a screenshot of it in the life group notes. And it encourages constructively us to maybe review some of the habits we easily absorb and invites us to develop patterns of living in which waiting is embraced rather than seen as a nuisance. So perhaps we can just have the second slide up, Alan, that would be great. When we take Jesus' yoke, our limited and very earthbound view of the world can be raised up to get God's perspective on life, on the challenges and the pains we face, the affairs of the world in which we live, which are extremely complex, as we know. And it's in this gentle relationship of teaching and learning that, as Isaiah puts it, he gives power to the faint and he strengthens the powerless and renews them. And this has the potential to slow us right down. Excuse me. Has the potential to slow us right down in our very busy world, busy lives. So let's come to the Lord again, maybe just adopt a posture of prayer, and let's invite him to share his yoke with us, that we would take that on and learn from him to see our lives, to see the wider world, the panorama as he sees it, for his pace to determine ours. So Lord, do just come now and minister to us in the quiet. Perhaps speak to us, to our hearts. Just as we were praying beforehand, someone in the group really brought out this idea of slowing down and allowing God to slow us down. We ask you to do this, Lord Jesus. And where we're in a rush, Lord, to not be racing, but walking with you.